Heavy rain pelted against the windows of Villa Samarapura as Victoria Sterling stood on the covered terrace, her 7-month pregnant belly pressing against the silk fabric of her evening dress. Thunder rolled across the Bali sky like an ominous warning, each crash seeming to mirror the turmoil building inside her chest. "Please, Richard, just open the door. I need my medication," she called through the heavy teak door of the master suite, her voice slightly breathless from the humid tropical air that clung to everything like a second skin. "You should have thought of that before you embarrassed me in front of the Hendersons," came the cold reply from her millionaire husband through the door. His clipped British accent carried the familiar tone of condescension that had become the soundtrack of their 20-year marriage, each word precisely chosen to inflict maximum damage. Victoria pressed her palm against the smooth wood, feeling the barrier between them like a physical weight. At 52, she had learned to recognize the signs of one of Richard's punishment sessions with the expertise of a meteorologist reading storm patterns. The isolation, the withholding of basic necessities, the calculated cruelty disguised as discipline. But this time felt different. This time she was carrying his child. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 2 decades, she had longed for children, only to be told repeatedly that Richard's business empire required their full attention. "Maybe next year," had become his standard refrain, always accompanied by detailed explanations of why the timing wasn't right. Market volatility, international expansion, regulatory challenges. There was always something more important than creating life together. Now, at 52 and 7 months pregnant with what would likely be her only child, Victoria found herself locked out of her own bedroom while a tropical storm raged outside. The metaphor was almost too obvious to bear. "Madam Victoria," Maya's soft voice came from behind her. The 28-year-old household manager approached with a concerned expression, her Indonesian accent gentle as always. "You should not be standing in the rain. It is not good for baby." Maya draped a cashmere throw around Victoria's shoulders and guided her to one of the cushioned chairs beneath the covered portion of the terrace. The young woman had been Victoria's anchor in this isolated paradise for the past 3 years. Ever since Richard had purchased the $50 million resort compound that had become both sanctuary and prison. "What did I do this time?" Victoria asked, accepting the cup of ginger tea Maya offered. The warm ceramic felt solid in her hands, grounding her in the present moment while her mind reeled from the evening's events. "You spoke your mind," Maya replied simply, settling into the chair beside her. "That is not a crime, despite what he tells you." "Huh," Victoria sipped the tea, grateful for its soothing warmth and the subtle hint of honey that Maya always added without being asked. These small acts of kindness had sustained her through countless difficult nights over the past 3 years. Maya understood what it meant to live under the control of a man who wielded kindness and cruelty with equal precision. The confrontation with Richard had started innocently enough. During dinner with the Hendersons, wealthy tourists from Connecticut who were considering investing in Richard's resort expansion, Victoria had mentioned her excitement about preparing a nursery for the baby. She had suggested converting the blue guest room, the one with the best morning light and ocean view, into a proper space for their child. Richard's reaction had been swift and cutting. "The baby will stay in the servants' quarters," he had announced, his voice carrying across the dining room with the authority of a royal decree. "That room is needed for business purposes." The Hendersons had exchanged uncomfortable glances, their wine glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Victoria had felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, the familiar heat of public humiliation that Richard seemed to enjoy inflicting. But something inside her, perhaps the protective instincts of impending motherhood, had refused to stay silent. "Richard, that's not appropriate for a newborn," she had said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The baby needs proper ventilation and natural light. The servants' quarters are cramped and noisy." The silence that followed had been deafening. Richard's blue eyes had turned glacial, and Victoria had known immediately that she would pay for her defiance. The Hendersons had finished their meal in uncomfortable silence, making polite excuses about early morning flights before disappearing into the humid Bali night. Now, locked out of her own bedroom while pregnant, Victoria wondered how many more nights like this she could endure. The pattern was always the same. Richard would find some infraction, real or imagined, and would punish her through isolation. Sometimes it lasted hours, sometimes days. The longest had been a week, when she had dared to question his decision to fire their longtime housekeeper in London without notice. "Maya," Victoria said softly, watching the rain create rivers down the glass panels of the terrace. "Do you ever regret leaving Jakarta?" The younger woman's dark eyes grew thoughtful, and Victoria could see the memories flickering across her face like shadows. "Leaving my ex-husband was the hardest thing I ever did," Maya said finally. "But staying would have killed me slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of who I used to be." Victoria nodded, understanding the weight behind Maya's words better than she wished she could. She had hired Maya 3 years ago, knowing the young woman was fleeing an abusive marriage. What Victoria hadn't expected was how much they would have in common, despite the vast differences in their circumstances. Money, it turned out, provided comfortable surroundings but offered little protection against emotional cruelty. "I used to think love meant sacrifice," Victoria continued, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain and distant thunder. "My mother taught me that marriage required compromise, that a good wife supported her husband's ambitions even when it meant setting aside her own dreams. But there's a difference between compromise and surrender, isn't there?" "Yes, madam, there is very big difference." The thunder grew closer, and Victoria felt the baby move restlessly in her womb, as if responding to the tension that filled the villa like smoke. She placed both hands on her belly, speaking silently to the child growing inside her. "This little one would never know what it felt like to walk on eggshells," she promised. "This baby would grow up understanding the difference between love and control, between partnership and dominance." "Maya, can you bring me my laptop?" Victoria asked suddenly, surprising herself with the decisiveness in her voice. "I want to look at something." "Of course, madam. Are you sure you should be working so late? The baby needs rest." "This isn't work. This is something I should have done years ago." As Maya disappeared into the villa, Victoria remained on the terrace, listening to the storm and feeling something shift inside her chest. For 20 years, she had accepted Richard's version of their story. He was the brilliant businessman who had elevated her from her middle-class background. She was the grateful wife who owed her comfortable lifestyle to his ambition and intelligence. She had been the supporting character in his narrative, never the protagonist of her own story. But tonight, with her unborn child restless in her womb and the storm mirroring her inner turmoil, something fundamental had changed. Maybe it was the pregnancy hormones. Maybe it was the accumulation of 2 decades of small humiliations. Maybe it was the realization that she was about to bring a child into a world where love was conditional and kindness was currency to be earned rather than freely given. Maya returned with the laptop, along with a fresh pot of tea and a plate of the coconut cookies that the villa's cook prepared especially for Victoria's pregnancy cravings. The small kindnesses meant more than Maya could possibly know. Victoria opened the laptop with trembling fingers, her heart racing with a combination of fear and determination. She navigated to her email and began typing a message she had been composing in her mind for months, maybe years. "Dear Benjamin," she wrote, addressing her father's old friend who had become one of London's most prominent international lawyers. "I hope this letter finds you well. I need your advice about some legal matters concerning my marriage and financial situation. When you have time, could we arrange a confidential call?" She hesitated before adding, "I think it's time I understood exactly what I signed 20 years ago, and what rights I might have that I've been told I don't possess." Victoria read the message 3 times before finding the courage to send it. As the email disappeared into cyberspace, she felt as if she had just stepped off a cliff, not knowing whether she would fall or fly. She closed the laptop and sat back in her chair, Maya's steady presence beside her providing comfort in the uncertainty. Both women listened to the rain and the distant sound of the ocean. Two survivors of different storms finding solace in their shared understanding of what it meant to love someone who confused control with care. "Madam Victoria," Mia said quietly, "my Uncle Wyan always says that the lotus flower grows most beautiful in muddy water. Sometimes the hardest circumstances create the strongest people." Victoria smiled, her hand moving protectively over her belly. "I hope my daughter inherits your uncle's wisdom. She will inherit her mother's strength. That will be enough." What Victoria didn't know was that her millionaire husband had just made the biggest mistake of his life. In his arrogance and need for control, Richard had chosen the wrong moment to show his true colors. The baby growing inside Victoria was not just a blessing she had longed for throughout their marriage. It was also leverage she didn't yet realize she possessed, and protection under laws she had never thought to investigate. Outside, the storm was just beginning. Inside Villa Samarapura, a different kind of storm was gathering strength, one that would reshape not just Victoria's life, but the lives of every woman who would eventually find sanctuary within these walls. The first drops of that internal storm had already fallen. Soon, it would become a flood that would wash away 20 years of carefully constructed lies and reveal the bedrock of truth beneath. 3 days earlier, in the steel and glass canyon of Manhattan, Richard Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 42nd floor office, surveying the city that had made his fortune. Sterling International occupied an entire floor of the prestigious building, with views stretching from Central Park to the Hudson River, each vista representing another conquered territory in his business empire. The office itself was a monument to success, decorated with photographs of Richard shaking hands with politicians, celebrities, and business moguls. Crystal awards lined mahogany shelves, while expensive art pieces spoke to wealth and refinement. Every detail had been carefully chosen to project power and achievement, from the Italian marble floors to the handmade Persian rugs that cost more than most people's annual salaries. "Congratulations, Richard," said James Murphy, sliding a thick folder across the mahogany conference table that could seat 12, but was designed to make anyone sitting across from Richard feel small and insignificant. "The Bali acquisition is officially complete." The 45-year-old lawyer's Brooklyn accent contrasted sharply with Richard's polished British tones, a reminder of the working-class origins that Richard had spent decades distancing himself from. Richard turned from the window, his smile triumphant and cold. At 58, he maintained the lean physique and sharp appearance that had served him well in business negotiations. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Savile Row suit immaculate, his handmade Italian shoes polished to mirror brightness. Every aspect of his appearance was calculated to project authority and control. 50 million well spent. "James," Richard said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had just acquired his most prized possession. "Villa Samarapura will be the crown jewel of the Sterling Resort collection. The location alone is worth twice what we paid." Sarah Chen, Richard's business partner and the company's chief financial officer, pulled up spreadsheets on her tablet with the efficiency of someone who spoke fluent numbers. The 38-year-old's precise diction reflected her background in international finance, and her reputation for aggressive deal-making had earned her respect in a field dominated by men like Richard. "The numbers look solid, Richard," she confirmed, scrolling through projected revenue streams and occupancy rates. "Projected revenues should cover the initial investment within 7 years, assuming we maintain premium pricing and target the ultra-high net worth demographic." "Excellent!" Richard poured himself a glass of Dom Perignon from the bottle that had been chilling in anticipation of this moment. The champagne caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, creating tiny celebrations in crystal that matched Richard's mood. "To the Sterling Empire," he announced, raising his glass with theatrical flair, "built by one man's vision and determination." James raised his own glass but hesitated, a frown creasing his weathered face. "Richard, I need to ask again about the deed structure. You're absolutely certain you want the property solely in your name? Most couples would." "Absolutely certain," Richard interrupted, his tone brooking no discussion. "Victoria had nothing to do with building this business. She's been a passenger, not a pilot. Why should she benefit from my strategic thinking and hard work?" Sarah exchanged a meaningful glance with James. Both had worked with Richard long enough to know that his marriage was complicated, but the deliberate exclusion of Victoria from property ownership seemed particularly harsh, even by Richard's standards. Sarah had met Victoria several times at corporate functions and found her intelligent and gracious, hardly the empty-headed trophy wife that Richard sometimes implied she was. "But didn't she contribute financially to the down payment?" Sarah asked carefully, her tone diplomatic but persistent. "The $2 million from her mother's estate represented a significant portion of the initial capital." Richard's expression hardened, and both lawyers could see the flash of irritation that crossed his features whenever Victoria's financial contributions were mentioned. "That money became marital property the moment we married 20 years ago," he said coldly. "I made the strategic decisions that turned $2 million into $50 million. I negotiated the deals, cultivated the relationships, and took the risks. I built this empire from nothing. James cleared his throat diplomatically, recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. Of course, Richard, I just want to ensure all documentation is properly handled for tax and liability purposes. International property ownership can be complex. Everything is perfectly legal. James, the prenup is ironclad, drafted by the best legal minds money could buy. Victoria signed away any claim to business assets 20 years ago, when she was grateful to escape her middle-class background and embrace the lifestyle I could provide. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Richard's phone buzzed with an incoming voicemail. He glanced at the screen and saw Victoria's contact information, along with the tiny heart emoji she had added years ago during happier times. The sight of it annoyed him now, a reminder of romantic sentiment that had long since been replaced by practical arrangement. "Excuse me," he said to his colleagues, stepping toward the window to listen to the message privately. His back turned to the room in a gesture of dismissal that both lawyers recognized. Victoria's voice filled his ear through the expensive, noise-canceling earbuds, breathless with excitement and what sounded like tears of joy. "Richard, darling, I have the most wonderful news. I just left Dr. Patel's office, and we're going to have a baby. I'm 7 weeks along. I know we hadn't planned this, but I'm so happy I can barely contain myself. The doctor says everything looks perfect, and I can already imagine our little family. Please call me when you get this. I love you so much." Richard stared at his reflection in the window glass, watching his expression shift from irritation to calculation. A baby, at 58, with his empire finally complete and his 5-year plan perfectly on track. The last thing he needed was the complication of a child. Children meant responsibility, emotional demands, and legal complications that could threaten everything he had built. He had successfully deflected Victoria's desires for children for 20 years, always with reasonable explanations about timing and business priorities. The early years had required building the foundation of Sterling International. The middle years had demanded international expansion. The recent years had focused on acquisition and consolidation. There had always been logical reasons why parenthood should be postponed. Now, at 52, Victoria was pregnant with their first child. The timing couldn't be worse, and Richard suspected it wasn't entirely accidental. Victoria had been increasingly assertive lately, questioning his decisions and expressing opinions that she had kept to herself for the first 2 decades of their marriage. The pregnancy would only amplify those tendencies. He rejoined Sarah and James at the conference table, slipping his phone into his jacket pocket with practiced casualness. "Personal matter," he said curtly. "Now, let's discuss the transition timeline for the Bali property and the staffing requirements." But as they talked through operational details, vendor contracts, and marketing strategies, Richard's mind wandered to the implications of Victoria's news. A baby would change everything. She would have legal claims that didn't exist in their current childless marriage, custody considerations, child support obligations, inheritance rights, complications he had spent 20 years carefully avoiding through legal planning and financial structure. "Richard," Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. "The insurance policies, what about them?" he asked, refocusing on the conversation with visible effort. "We need to update the coverage for the new property. James mentioned some changes to your personal policies as well." Richard nodded slowly, an idea beginning to form. "Yes, let's schedule a meeting with the insurance broker next week. I want to review all policies thoroughly, both business and personal." James made a note on his legal pad. "I'll set that up. Anything specific you want to focus on?" "Life insurance, primarily. I want to ensure the business is protected in case of any unforeseen circumstances. And given certain personal developments, we may need to restructure some aspects of the coverage." The conversation continued for another hour, covering regulatory compliance, international tax implications, and staff housing arrangements for the Bali property. But Richard's attention kept drifting to the voicemail on his phone and the strategic challenges it represented. When his colleagues finally left, promising to have updated contracts ready for review by the end of the week, Richard remained in his office as the Manhattan sky darkened into evening. He retrieved his phone and listened to Victoria's message again, this time focusing not on her joy, but on the legal implications of her words. Victoria had always wanted children. And he had successfully managed those desires for 2 decades through a combination of logical arguments and emotional manipulation. He had convinced her that their marriage was perfect as it was, that children would complicate their lifestyle and interfere with their travels. He had painted parenthood as selfish when there were so many business opportunities that required their full attention. Now, at 52, and likely her last chance for biological motherhood, she was pregnant with their first child. The pregnancy represented not just an emotional milestone, but a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of their marriage. Richard opened his contacts and scrolled to Dr. Martin Webb, a private investigator he had used for various business purposes over the years. The man specialized in what he called reputation management and risk assessment, services that had proven valuable in several complicated business negotiations. The conversation was brief and coded, conducted in the careful language of men who understood that certain arrangements were best left undocumented. "I need a comprehensive assessment of my wife's current situation," Richard explained. "Daily activities, emotional state, social connections, potential areas of instability, the kind of documentation that might be relevant in future legal proceedings." "Understood," Webb replied. "How detailed do you want the surveillance? Document everything. I may need evidence of erratic behavior or emotional instability for custody purposes. The subject is currently pregnant, which adds psychological complexity to the situation. I'll need a retainer and some basic information to get started. Money is no object. I want complete documentation, professionally prepared and legally admissible. And Webb. This needs to be handled with absolute discretion." After ending the call, Richard poured himself another glass of champagne and returned to the window. The city lights twinkled below like stars, each one representing an opportunity, a conquest, a victory in the empire he had built through careful planning and ruthless execution. But empires required constant maintenance, and sometimes threats emerged from unexpected quarters. The voicemail on his phone represented exactly such a threat, not from business competitors or regulatory challenges, but from the woman who shared his bed and now carried his child. Richard had built his fortune by identifying potential problems before they became actual crises. Victoria's pregnancy was a problem that required immediate strategic planning. The child would complicate any future divorce proceedings, but it also provided opportunities for leverage that didn't exist in their current arrangement. He opened his laptop and began researching international custody law, prenatal psychology, and the legal precedents for determining parental fitness in high-net-worth divorces. If Victoria thought that pregnancy would give her additional power in their marriage, she was about to learn how wrong she could be. Knowledge was power, and Richard Sterling had built his empire on superior information and strategic thinking. The baby growing inside Victoria would become just another factor in his carefully constructed business plan for their marriage. Back in Bali, Victoria had no idea that her joyful announcement had already been recontextualized as a business problem requiring professional solutions. She had no idea that her millionaire husband was already planning her removal from the paradise she had grown to love, or that the child she carried would become a pawn in a game she didn't even know was being played. The Sterling Empire was about to expand its operations into new territory, the systematic destruction of a marriage that had outlived its usefulness. And like all of Richard's business ventures, this one would be executed with precision, documentation, and complete attention to legal details. The only variable Richard hadn't accounted for was the possibility that Victoria might be stronger than he had calculated, or that the isolated paradise of Bali might contain resources and allies that could challenge his carefully laid plans. The morning sun streamed through the open pavilion where Victoria sat with Maya, arranging tropical flowers in tall ceramic vases with the meditative focus of someone seeking peace in simple tasks. The villa's staff was preparing for another dinner party, one of the regular social events that Richard used to cultivate business relationships and project the image of sophisticated success. Victoria had learned to find meaning in these small moments of beauty creation, even when the larger canvas of her life felt beyond her control. "The hibiscus should go higher," Maya suggested gently, adjusting a bright red bloom that seemed to glow in the morning light. "In Bali, we believe the flowers carry prayers to the ancestors, and the higher they reach, the more likely the prayers are to be heard." Victoria smiled, appreciating the cultural wisdom that Maya shared so naturally. These moments of connection had become one of her greatest joys during their 3 years at the villa. "What would you pray for today?" she asked, carefully positioning a delicate white orchid among the more vibrant blooms. "Wisdom for difficult times ahead," Maya replied, her dark eyes serious and knowing, "and strength for the choices that must be made." "And you, Madam Victoria, what prayers would you send to your ancestors?" "Courage to make the right choices for my baby," Victoria answered, her hand unconsciously moving to her growing belly. At 7 months pregnant, she felt the weight of responsibility more keenly each day, not just for the life growing inside her, but for the kind of world she was bringing her child into. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their peaceful moment, and both women looked up to see Dr. Priya Sharma walking through the villa's gardens with her medical bag in hand. The 42-year-old obstetrician had become not just Victoria's doctor, but a trusted friend during her pregnancy. One of the few people who seemed to understand the complexities of her situation without judgment or pity. "Good morning, ladies," Dr. Sharma said, her warm Indian accent bringing comfort to the morning air like a familiar melody. "How are we feeling today?" "Victoria, any changes since our last appointment?" "Better in some way," Victoria replied honestly. "The morning sickness has finally subsided completely, though I still feel tired quite often, and the baby seems more active, especially at night when I'm trying to sleep." Dr. Sharma set down her bag and performed a quick preliminary examination, checking Victoria's blood pressure with efficient movements that spoke of years of experience. As she listened to the baby's heartbeat with a portable monitor, the strong, rhythmic sound filled the pavilion like a drumbeat of life and hope. "The heartbeat is excellent," the doctor announced with satisfaction. "Strong and regular, but I'm still concerned about your stress levels. Victoria, the elevated blood pressure we discussed last week hasn't improved as much as I'd hoped." Victoria exchanged a meaningful glance with Maya, both women understanding the unspoken implications of the doctor's concern. "It's been a challenging few weeks," Victoria said carefully, not wanting to elaborate on the specific sources of her stress in such a public setting. "The isolation isn't healthy for you or the baby," Dr. Sharma said directly, her medical training overriding social politeness. "Pregnant women need emotional support and community connection, not punishment and withdrawal. The physiological effects of chronic stress can be severe." The doctor's blunt assessment hung in the air like humidity, impossible to ignore. Victoria appreciated Priya's directness, even though it highlighted truths she wasn't ready to fully confront. In her heart, she knew that her marriage had become a source of chronic stress rather than support, but acknowledging that reality felt like stepping into an abyss. "Dr. Sharma," Victoria said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who had learned to navigate conversational minefields. "Hypothetically speaking, what happens if stress levels remain consistently high during the final trimester of pregnancy? In severe cases, chronic stress can lead to premature labor, low birth weight, or developmental issues for the baby," the doctor replied with clinical honesty. "More immediately, it can cause dangerous spikes in blood pressure for the mother, potentially leading to preeclampsia or other serious complications." The medical reality hit Victoria like a physical blow, removing any possibility of denial or rationalization. Her marriage wasn't just damaging her emotional well-being anymore. It was actively threatening the health and safety of her unborn child. The knowledge felt like a weight settling in her chest, heavy and inescapable. Ketut, the 35-year-old groundskeeper, appeared at the pavilion's edge with fresh-cut flowers from the garden, his weathered hands gentle as he arranged the blooms in Maya's direction. His broken English had improved dramatically during Victoria's residence at the villa, partly through Maya's patient teaching and partly through his own determination to communicate with the foreign guests. "Madam Victoria, beautiful morning for baby," he said with a warm smile that reached his eyes, offering her a perfect white orchid with the ceremony of someone presenting a gift of great significance. In Bali tradition, white orchid brings protection for mother and child. Very powerful flower for keeping away bad spirits. "Thank you, Ketut. That's very thoughtful," Victoria replied, accepting the flower and feeling touched by the genuine care in his gesture. The gardens have never looked more beautiful than they do now. As Dr. Sharma packed her equipment, Victoria found herself studying the faces of the people around her with new appreciation. Maya, Priya, Ketut. In 3 years at the villa, they had become more than employees or service providers. They had become her chosen family, the people who saw her as a whole person rather than an accessory to someone else's success story. Dr. Sharma, Victoria said suddenly, surprising herself with the directness of her question. Hypothetically speaking, what legal protections exist for pregnant women in situations of domestic stress or emotional abuse? The doctor paused in her packing, her intelligent eyes focusing on Victoria with increased attention. In Indonesia, there are very strong family protection laws, she replied carefully. International courts also recognize pregnancy as a factor requiring special consideration in custody and property disputes. The law tends to favor protecting pregnant women and their unborn children, even for foreign nationals with significant property holdings, especially for foreign nationals with significant property holdings in Indonesia, Dr. Sharma said with quiet emphasis. The courts take a very dim view of wealthy men who use isolation and financial control against pregnant wives. There have been several high-profile cases that established important precedents. Victoria absorbed this information carefully, filing it away for future consideration. She had never thought of her situation in legal terms before, but Dr. Sharma's clinical perspective was opening doors in her mind that had been closed for 20 years. That evening, Richard returned from his business trip to New York, his mood darker and more volatile than usual. Victoria could sense the tension radiating from him like heat from pavement, and she recognized the signs that preceded his most difficult periods. Something had happened during his trip that had triggered his need to reassert control over his immediate environment. During dinner on the main terrace, surrounded by the sounds of tropical evening and the gentle lighting that made everything seem peaceful and civilized, Victoria attempted to discuss practical matters related to the pregnancy with the same diplomatic care she would use in international negotiations. "I've been thinking more about the nursery," she said gently, cutting her grilled fish into small pieces while trying to keep her tone light and conversational. "The blue room really would be perfect for the baby. The morning light is so beautiful, and it's close enough to our room for nighttime feedings without being disruptive to your sleep schedule." Richard's fork clattered against his plate with sharp emphasis, the sound cutting through the peaceful evening like a discordant note. "That room is my office," he said with cold finality. "How many times must I explain this to you? I need that space for business purposes." "But Richard, once the baby arrives, you'll need to accommodate some changes to the living arrangements," Victoria persisted, knowing she was entering dangerous territory but feeling compelled to advocate for her child's needs. "The office could be relocated to the smaller room, or we could convert part of the library. The baby can stay in the servants' quarters until we decide on permanent arrangements," Richard snapped, his voice carrying across the terrace with unmistakable authority. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar flush of public humiliation that Richard seemed to enjoy provoking. "The servants' quarters," she repeated, hardly believing what she was hearing. "Richard, that's not appropriate for a newborn baby. There's no proper ventilation. The noise from the kitchen would be constant, and the space is completely unsuitable for infant care." "Don't tell me what's appropriate in my own house," Richard said, his voice rising to a level that made the serving staff freeze in their movements. Maya, who was supervising the dinner service, stopped mid-step at the edge of the dining area, her face carefully neutral but her body language tense with concern. "This is our house, Richard," Victoria said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "And our baby deserves better than servants' quarters. Everything you see here exists because of my work, my vision, my investment," Richard replied, his words like ice chips thrown across the table. "You seem to forget that rather conveniently when it suits your purposes." Victoria set down her fork, her appetite completely gone. The baby moved restlessly in her womb, as if responding to the tension crackling in the air around them. "I haven't forgotten anything," she said with quiet dignity, "including the $2 million from my mother's estate that made the down payment possible on this property." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of waves and the nervous rustling of palm fronds in the evening breeze. Richard's blue eyes turned glacial, and Victoria realized she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But for the first time in 20 years, she didn't immediately rush to apologize or take back her words. "We'll discuss this privately," Richard said, his voice dangerously quiet but vibrating with barely controlled fury. The remainder of dinner passed in tense silence, with both of them mechanically eating while the tropical paradise around them seemed to fade into irrelevance. When Richard's phone rang during dessert, He stepped away from the table to take the call, speaking in hushed tones that Victoria couldn't quite hear, but that carried the unmistakable cadence of professional consultation. But she caught fragments that made her blood run cold: custody concerns, and prenatal stress, and documented incidents, and emotional instability. The words floated across the terrace like poison in the evening air, and Victoria realized with growing horror that Richard wasn't just angry about their argument. He was planning something far more calculated and devastating than his usual punishment sessions. For the first time in their marriage, Victoria wondered if Richard was planning something beyond their usual patterns of conflict and reconciliation. The conversation sounded too professional, too calculated to be a casual business call. It sounded like the kind of strategic planning that Richard brought to his most important business acquisitions. As the evening ended and Richard retreated to his office for more phone calls, Victoria found herself alone on the terrace with Maya, both women pretending to oversee the dinner cleanup while actually processing the disturbing tenor of the evening's events. "Madam Victoria," Maya said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, "my uncle Wayan is a village elder who knows many things about Indonesian law and protecting women in difficult situations." "What kind of things?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says that knowledge is power, but first you must know exactly what you're fighting for and what weapons your opponent might use against you," Maya replied, her words carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "He has helped many women navigate legal challenges when their husbands try to use money and power to control them." Victoria nodded slowly, beginning to understand that Maya was offering more than casual conversation. She was offering an alliance, a connection to resources and knowledge that could prove essential in whatever was coming next. Later that night, as Victoria lay in the guest room that had become her temporary refuge, she felt the baby kick strongly against her ribs in what seemed like a response to her elevated heart rate and stress hormones. The little one seemed restless, responding to the tension that filled the villa like smoke from a smoldering fire. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered to her belly, her hands protectively cradling her unborn child. "Mama's going to figure this out. We're going to find a way to keep you safe and give you the life you deserve." But even as she spoke the words, Victoria wondered if she was making promises she couldn't keep. The stakes had never been higher, and Richard's behavior suggested he was planning something she couldn't yet see clearly, but that threatened everything she held dear. What she didn't know was that her millionaire husband was already several moves ahead in a game she was just beginning to understand. The conversation she had overheard was only the tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper than she could imagine, threatening not just her marriage but her freedom, her child, and her future. The gathering storm was about to break over Villa Samarapura, and Victoria would need every ally she could find to survive what was coming next. 2 weeks later, midnight in Bali found Victoria unable to sleep, despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion during the final trimester of pregnancy. The combination of physical discomfort and mounting anxiety had made rest nearly impossible, leaving her wide awake while the tropical night hummed with life around the villa. She had tried every position the pregnancy books recommended, arranged pillows in countless configurations, and even attempted the meditation techniques that Dr. Priya had taught her. Nothing worked. Her mind raced with concerns about the future, replaying Richard's increasingly hostile behavior and the fragments of phone conversations she had been overhearing with growing frequency. Wrapping a light silk robe around her growing body, Victoria stepped onto the villa's covered walkway, grateful for the cool night air that provided some relief from the oppressive weight of her thoughts. The sounds of the tropical night surrounded her like a symphony of hidden life, chirping geckos calling to their mates, rustling palm fronds responding to gentle breezes, and the distant rhythmic crash of waves against the cliff below. As she walked slowly toward the garden pavilion, hoping the gentle movement might ease both her restlessness and the ache in her lower back, Victoria noticed light spilling from Richard's office window. The golden glow seemed incongruous in the peaceful darkness, and she could hear his voice speaking in the measured, professional tones he reserved for his most important business calls. Something about the late hour and secretive nature of the conversation made her pause. In 20 years of marriage, Richard had never conducted business calls at midnight unless they involved crisis management or highly sensitive negotiations. Victoria moved closer to the window, staying in the shadows of the flowering bougainvillea that climbed the villa's walls like a living tapestry. The pregnancy complicates things significantly, But her emotional instability during this period actually gives us substantial leverage, Richard was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the open window, with clinical detachment that chilled Victoria to the bone. Victoria's breath caught in her throat, and she pressed closer to the wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was afraid it might give away her presence. Every instinct told her to flee, but she forced herself to stay and listen, understanding that this might be her only chance to understand what Richard was planning. "Document everything, James," Richard continued with businesslike efficiency. "We need her looking completely unfit for custody when the time comes to file. The pregnancy gives us a perfect window to establish a pattern of erratic behavior and emotional instability." "What about the household staff?" came James Murphy's voice through the computer speakers, tinny but clearly audible. "They see her daily interactions and might contradict claims of instability." "They're employees," Richard replied with casual dismissal. "They'll say whatever they're paid to say, or they'll find themselves looking for new employment. Besides, I'm already documenting her isolation, her mood swings, her inability to maintain proper social connections. The punishment sessions provide excellent evidence of someone who can't handle stress appropriately." Victoria felt dizzy, gripping the window ledge for support as 20 years of marriage suddenly recontextualized themselves in her mind with horrifying clarity. The punishment sessions, the systematic isolation, the constant criticism of her social behavior. None of it had been marital dysfunction or personality conflicts. It had all been calculated preparation for this moment, carefully orchestrated evidence gathering for a legal strategy she had never seen coming. "The financial picture remains solid from our perspective," James continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone reviewing a successful business plan. "The prenup protects all business assets, and her name isn't on any of the major properties. She has no independent income stream and no significant assets in her own name." "Exactly as planned," Richard said with satisfaction. "When we file for divorce and full custody, she'll have no financial resources to mount an effective legal defense. She'll be desperate to accept whatever settlement we offer, especially when faced with the alternative of a protracted legal battle she can't afford. And if she attempts to fight the custody arrangement—" Richard's laugh was devoid of warmth or humor, a sound that made Victoria's skin crawl with its calculated cruelty. "Then we document her refusal to accept reasonable terms as further evidence of mental instability and poor judgment. Either way, I retain complete control of the assets and the child." Victoria's hand moved instinctively to her belly, a protective gesture that felt simultaneously fierce and futile. Her legs trembled with the effort of remaining upright as she processed the systematic nature of Richard's deception. This wasn't love. This had never been love. For 20 years, she had been living with a man who saw her not as a partner to be cherished, but as an obstacle to be managed and eventually eliminated. "The isolation strategy continues to work perfectly," Richard continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning was yielding expected results. "No close friends here, no family support system, complete financial dependence. She's completely reliant on me emotionally and practically. Just be careful about the documentation, Richard," James warned. "International custody cases can become complicated very quickly if there's clear evidence of systematic abuse or manipulation." "What abuse?" Richard replied with practiced innocence. "I've never laid a hand on her. Emotional distance isn't a crime, and prenatal depression is well documented in women her age, especially first-time mothers facing the stress of late-in-life pregnancy." Victoria pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. The casual way Richard dismissed and weaponized her emotional pain was almost more devastating than the legal maneuvering itself. He had taken her deepest vulnerabilities and turned them into ammunition against her. The conversation continued for several more minutes, covering logistics and timelines that made Victoria's head spin with their complexity and thoroughness. Richard had been planning this destruction for months, possibly years, with the same attention to detail he brought to his most important business acquisitions. When she finally heard Richard ending the call and beginning to shut down his computer, Victoria crept back toward the guest wing, her mind reeling with the magnitude of what she had discovered. Every step felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her feet had fundamentally shifted and could no longer be trusted to support her weight. In the hallway outside her temporary bedroom, she encountered Maya, who was carrying a tray with chamomile tea and a small plate of the ginger cookies that helped Victoria manage her pregnancy-related nausea. The young woman took one look at Victoria's pale face and wide eyes and immediately set down the tray. "Madam Victoria, you look like you've seen a ghost. Are you feeling all right? Is the baby okay?" Victoria looked at Maya's concerned face and made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. For 20 years, she had kept Richard's emotional abuse private, making excuses and covering for his behavior even to herself. But the stakes were too high now to maintain that protective silence. "Maya, I need to ask you something very important," Victoria said, her voice trembling but determined. "Your Uncle Wyan, the village elder you mentioned, can I trust him with information that could be dangerous if it reached the wrong people?" "With your life, madam," Maya replied without hesitation. "He has helped many women in situations that seemed impossible. He understands both Indonesian law and international law, and he has connections throughout the legal community. I need to meet with him as soon as possible. Privately, without Richard knowing." Maya set down the tray completely and studied Victoria's face with growing concern. "What has happened? What did you discover?" "I think Richard is planning to take my baby away from me," Victoria said, the words feeling surreal even as she spoke them. "And I think he's been planning it for a very long time. Everything about our marriage, everything I thought I understood about our relationship, has been a lie designed to set up this moment." Maya's expression hardened with recognition and anger. "Come," she said firmly, guiding Victoria toward the kitchen where they could speak without fear of being overheard. "We will make tea and you will tell me everything you heard. Then tomorrow, Uncle Wyan will explain your options and help you understand what power you actually have." As they sat in the villa's spacious kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable domesticity of copper pots and herb gardens visible through the windows, Victoria found herself speaking more honestly than she had in years. She told Maya about the overheard conversation, about the systematic pattern of isolation and control she was finally beginning to recognize, about her growing fear that she was trapped in a situation that threatened both her freedom and her child's future. "In my village," Maya said quietly when Victoria had finished her story, "we have an old saying, 'The bamboo that bends in the storm survives, but the tree that cannot bend is destroyed.' You have been bending for 20 years, Madam Victoria, adapting and surviving his storms. Perhaps it is time to show that your roots are stronger than his storms, and that bamboo can also grow tall enough to tower over the trees that try to overshadow it." Victoria sipped her tea, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. For the first time in 2 decades, she was contemplating active resistance instead of passive acceptance. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "Maya, what if I don't have any real legal rights here? What if the prenup really does leave me with nothing, and I'm just deluding myself about having options?" "Uncle Wyan says that knowledge is true power, but only when it's complete knowledge," Maya replied with quiet confidence. "Tomorrow, we will discover exactly what power you have and what weapons you can use to protect yourself and your baby. But tonight, you must rest. Your child needs a strong mother, and strength requires sleep." As Victoria finally settled into bed, her mind was clearer than it had been in weeks despite the disturbing nature of what she had learned. The overheard conversation had been devastating, but it had also been illuminating in the most important way possible. She now understood the game being played against her, which meant she could finally begin to play back. Outside her window, the tropical night sang its ancient songs of resilience and renewal. Victoria placed both hands on her belly and spoke silently to her unborn child, making promises that felt both desperate and determined. "I don't know exactly what's going to happen," she whispered into the darkness, "but I promise you this, you will never live in fear the way I have. Whatever it takes, however hard the fight becomes, you will know what real love looks like, and you will grow up free." The baby responded with a strong kick, as if acknowledging the pact between mother and child, as if already preparing for the battle ahead. Victoria was about to discover that knowledge truly is power, especially when it's wielded by a woman who has finally stopped underestimating herself and started understanding the strength that comes from having everything to lose and nothing left to fear. The game was changing, and Victoria Sterling was finally ready to play. The next morning brought the kind of crystalline clarity that sometimes follows the darkest revelations. Victoria waited until Richard left for his weekly massage appointment at the resort spa, a ritual he maintained with religious precision every Thursday morning. Maya had confirmed that he would be gone for at least 2 hours, followed by his usual lunch meeting with potential investors, giving them a precious window of opportunity to uncover the truth about Victoria's legal and financial position. Uncle Wyan is already waiting in the garden pavilion, Maya whispered as she led Victoria toward Richard's private office, her voice barely audible even though they were alone in the villa. But first, he says you must know exactly what you're fighting for and what resources you actually have available. Victoria's hands trembled as Maya produced a key to Richard's office door, the small piece of metal feeling impossibly heavy with the weight of what it represented. How did you get access to his private office? House manager has master keys to all areas for cleaning, maintenance, and emergency situations. Maya replied with a slight smile that carried years of hard-earned wisdom. Sometimes that access becomes very important for protecting the people who live in the house. The office was Richard's most private domain, a shrine to his business achievements decorated with expensive art and photographs chronicling his rise to wealth and power. Victoria had rarely been invited inside during their 3 years at the villa, and now she understood why. This room contained the real story of their marriage, the financial architecture that supported Richard's version of their relationship. Maya moved directly to Richard's massive mahogany desk and began opening drawers with systematic efficiency. Uncle Wyan says that financial documents tell the real story of any marriage, she explained, her voice steady despite the risk they were taking. Numbers and contracts don't lie the way people do. They show where the power really lives. Victoria hesitated at the threshold, 20 years of conditioning making her reluctant to violate Richard's privacy, even in the face of his systematic betrayal. Maya, if Richard discovers that we've been in here— Madam Victoria, Maya interrupted gently but firmly, you heard him planning to take your baby and destroy your life. This is not the time for politeness or following his rules. This is the time for protecting yourself and your child. The first drawer revealed the expected items: expensive pens, business cards from influential contacts, appointment calendars filled with meetings and social obligations. But the second drawer contained a thick folder labeled Villa Simarapura, acquisition documents and property records. And Victoria's heart began racing as she realized what they had found. Victoria opened the folder with shaking hands and began reading through documents that were complex and filled with legal language designed to obscure rather than clarify. But certain numbers jumped out at her immediately, figures that told a story very different from the one Richard had been spinning for 3 years. Purchase price, $50 million. Down payment, $2 million from Sterling Family Trust, estate of Margaret Victoria Pemberton. Additional financing, $48 million in commercial loans secured against multiple properties. Maya, look at this, Victoria said, her voice filled with growing understanding and anger. The down payment for this villa came directly from my mother's trust fund, but the deed is registered solely in Richard's name. According to these documents, I have no legal ownership despite providing the initial capital. Maya leaned over Victoria's shoulder, studying the financial records with the sharp attention of someone who understood that details could mean the difference between freedom and captivity. What is Sterling Family Trust? Is that your money? Every penny of it, Victoria replied, her voice growing stronger as the magnitude of Richard's deception became clear. My mother left me $2.5 million when she died 10 years ago. I put it in a family trust for tax purposes, but Richard convinced me to make him a co-trustee so he could help manage the investments more efficiently. They continued searching through the desk, finding increasingly disturbing documentation with each new folder. Insurance policies worth more than the actual property values. Financial statements showing that Sterling International was heavily leveraged, with debts that far exceeded the company's actual assets. Business plans that relied on continued property acquisition using funds from Victoria's trust. In the bottom drawer, Maya discovered a manila envelope marked Personal Confidential Attorney Work Product, and the contents made Victoria's blood run cold as she realized the scope and timeline of Richard's planning. This is a petition for divorce, Victoria said, reading through the legal document with growing horror. It's already partially completed, dated 6 months ago. Look at the custody section. He's requesting full physical and legal custody of our unborn child. The petition painted Victoria as an emotionally unstable wife who had become increasingly erratic and potentially dangerous during her pregnancy. It cited her supposed inability to maintain social relationships, her mood swings, her unreasonable demands about household arrangements, and her growing dependence on household staff for emotional support as evidence of her unfitness for motherhood. "There's more," Maya said grimly, pulling out additional papers that revealed the true extent of Richard's strategic planning. Medical consultation records with a psychiatrist about managing an unstable spouse during high-risk pregnancy, financial affidavits claiming all marital assets are solely his property, even character witness statements from business associates describing you as emotionally fragile and overly dependent. Victoria sank into Richard's leather chair, overwhelmed by the systematic nature of his betrayal. Every argument, every punishment session, every moment of isolation had been carefully orchestrated not just to control her behavior, but to build a legal case against her fitness as a mother and wife. The most devastating discovery was a timeline document outlining Richard's strategy for the divorce proceedings. Phase 1, establish pattern of emotional instability during pregnancy. Phase 2, document financial dependence and social isolation. Phase 3, file for divorce and emergency custody immediately after birth when Victoria would be most vulnerable. Phase 4, offer minimal settlement in exchange for her agreement to supervised visitation rights. "Maya, I need to call Benjamin Cole immediately," Victoria said, her voice gaining strength as shock transformed into determination. "He's a lawyer in London who knew my father and has been handling some of my family's legal matters." "Use the office phone," Maya suggested, glancing toward the door to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Uncle Wyan says international calls from office lines are harder to trace than mobile calls, and the conversation will be more secure." Victoria dialed Benjamin's number with fingers that had stopped trembling, finding strength in the clarity that came with finally understanding her true situation. When his familiar, cultured voice answered immediately, she felt the first spark of hope she had experienced in months. "Victoria, my dear, how lovely to hear from you. How are you enjoying your tropical paradise?" "Benjamin, I need your help urgently. Legal help. I think I'm in very serious trouble, and my unborn child may be in danger." The concern in Benjamin's voice was immediate and complete. "What kind of trouble? Tell me everything, and don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem." Victoria explained everything she had discovered: the overheard conversation, the divorce papers, the financial documentation that revealed the scope of Richard's deception, the systematic way he had been building a case against her for months. Benjamin's 67 years of legal experience came through in his increasingly sharp and focused questions. "Victoria, the documents you're describing about the prenuptial agreement, can you locate the original signature pages and read me the financial disclosure section exactly as written?" Victoria searched through the files until she found the prenup, a document she remembered signing 20 years ago but had never fully understood. "Yes, here it is. The disclosure section says that Richard's total assets at the time of marriage were valued at approximately $500,000, with no outstanding debts exceeding $50,000. Benjamin's sharp intake of breath was audible across the international connection. "My dear, that document is not just unconscionable, it's fraudulent. Your father would be absolutely appalled if he knew what Richard had done." "What do you mean?" "Based on what you've told me about the business records you found, Richard was carrying debts exceeding £2 million at the time of your marriage, and he deliberately concealed those obligations from you," Benjamin explained with growing anger. "In international law, that level of non-disclosure completely invalidates the prenuptial agreement. Additionally, using your family trust funds for property purchases without proper documentation and ownership transfer gives you substantial legal claims that he's been systematically hiding from you." Victoria felt a rush of relief and vindication so strong it made her dizzy. "Benjamin, can you help me? Is there actually something we can do to protect my baby and secure my rights?" "My dear, I've been waiting 20 years for this call," Benjamin said with quiet intensity. "I never trusted that man from the moment your father introduced him to the family, and I'm certainly not about to let him steal your inheritance and your child through legal manipulation and emotional abuse. What should I do right now? First, photograph every document you can find with your phone and send them to my secure email address immediately. Everything: financial records, business plans, insurance policies, legal drafts, everything. Second, Do absolutely nothing to alert Richard that you've discovered his plans. Third, I'm going to make some urgent calls to colleagues who specialize in international family law and emergency custody protection. Victoria and Maya spent the next 90 minutes carefully photographing every relevant document they could find, working with the efficiency of people who understood that time was not on their side. With each image uploaded to Benjamin's secure server, Victoria felt her legal position becoming clearer and stronger. Madam Victoria, Maya said as they prepared to restore the office to its original state, Uncle Wyan will want to hear about all of these papers. In Indonesian law, pregnant women have very strong protection, especially when there is clear evidence of financial abuse and systematic deception by wealthy foreign nationals. As they meticulously returned every document to its original position, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years, genuine hope for justice. Not just hope for escape or survival, but hope that the truth might actually prevail over manipulation and that her rights might be stronger than Richard's money and influence. Maya, what happens if Richard somehow discovers what we found before we can take legal action? Then we move faster than he does, Maya replied with quiet confidence. Uncle Wyan has connections throughout the Bali legal community, including family court judges and international law specialists. Some of those connections might surprise your millionaire husband when he discovers that money and power have limits in a country that protects pregnant women and their children. Victoria locked the office door behind them, knowing that she had just crossed a line from which there could be no return. But for the first time in her marriage, crossing that line felt like moving toward freedom rather than deeper into captivity. In the garden pavilion, an elderly Balinese man waited patiently in the dappled shade of frangipani trees, his weathered hands folded in his lap and his eyes holding the wisdom of someone who had spent decades helping women navigate seemingly impossible situations. Uncle Wyan's presence radiated the kind of calm authority that comes from deep experience with both human nature and legal systems. Miss Victoria, he said in careful but confident English, Maya tells me you are ready to know your true power. This is very good, but power must be used wisely and quickly. Your husband moves like a man who believes he has already won the game. Victoria sat across from him, her hands instinctively protecting her growing belly. What do you think I should do? What are my real options? First, we must understand Indonesian law completely. Second, we must understand international law and how it applies to your situation. Third, we must understand that justice can move much faster than injustice when the right people are paying attention and the evidence is clear. What do you mean by that? Uncle Wyan smiled, and Victoria saw steel beneath his gentle demeanor. You are about to discover that your millionaire husband chose the wrong country for his legal games and greatly underestimated the woman he was trying to destroy. Indonesia protects pregnant women very strongly, and truth has a way of surfacing when powerful people become too confident in their own cleverness. As the afternoon sun slanted through the pavilion, casting complex patterns of light and shadow, Victoria felt the baby kick strongly against her ribs. This time, instead of anxiety, the movement filled her with fierce determination and protective love. Richard had spent months planning her destruction with the thoroughness he brought to his most important business deal. Now it was time to show him what 20 years of systematic underestimation had cost him, and what happened when a woman finally understood the difference between survival and surrender. The truth was more powerful than Richard's lies, and Victoria was finally ready to wield it. The next morning brought more than just sunrise to Villa Samarapura. Victoria woke to the sound of Richard's voice raised in fury, echoing from his office across the villa compound, with the kind of rage that made the tropical birds fall silent and the household staff freeze in their morning routines. Maya, Richard's bellow carried through the humid air like thunder before a storm. Maya, get in here immediately. Victoria wrapped a silk robe around her pregnant body and hurried toward the main pavilion as quickly as her condition would allow. Arriving to find Richard standing in his office doorway, with his face flushed red with anger, and his expensive silk pajamas wrinkled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. Someone has been through my private papers, he announced to the assembled household staff, his voice vibrating with barely controlled fury. Files have been moved, drawers have been searched, and someone has accessed my personal computer. I want to know who, and I want to know right now. Maya stepped forward with the calm dignity of someone who had faced angry men before and survived. Sir, the office was cleaned yesterday afternoon as scheduled, Perhaps some papers were moved during the regular dusting and organizing. I can check with the cleaning staff if you would like. Dusting doesn't explain why confidential legal documents were out of order, why my computer shows recent access, and why there are fingerprints on my private telephone. Richard snapped, his eyes scanning the faces of the staff like a predator searching for signs of weakness. Victoria felt her heart racing, but forced herself to remain composed, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Maya had warned her that discovery was inevitable once Richard began his morning routine, and they had prepared for this confrontation with the thoroughness of generals planning a crucial battle. "Richard," Victoria said carefully, stepping into the charged atmosphere of the pavilion, "what exactly is missing? Perhaps I can help you locate whatever you're looking for." Richard's eyes locked onto hers with laser intensity, and Victoria could see the calculations running behind his cold blue gaze. He was searching for tells, for signs of guilt or knowledge that would confirm his suspicions about who had violated his sanctuary. "Nothing is missing, Victoria," he said with dangerous quiet. "But someone has been snooping through highly confidential business documents, and whoever did it will face serious consequences for corporate espionage and invasion of privacy." At that moment, the sound of a car approaching interrupted the tense scene, its engine noise cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a reprieve from an execution. Through the office window, Victoria could see a sleek black sedan navigating the villa's circular driveway with the confidence of expected guests. "Who is that?" Richard demanded, his paranoia now extending to any unexpected arrival. "I'm not expecting anyone this morning, and I specifically instructed that we were not to be disturbed." Maya checked her scheduling tablet with professional efficiency. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson are arriving this morning for the breakfast meeting you scheduled yesterday. They mentioned that they have a friend visiting Bali who wanted to see the property and discuss potential investment opportunities." Richard's expression shifted rapidly from anger to forced politeness as he recognized the need to maintain his carefully cultivated image for potential business partners. The Hendersons represented connections to Connecticut society and possible access to investment capital that his leveraged empire desperately needed. "Fine," he said curtly, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "Victoria, make yourself presentable immediately. Maya, serve breakfast on the main terrace in 30 minutes, and make sure everything is perfect. We'll continue this investigation after our guests leave." Victoria hurried to dress, choosing her clothes with the same care she would have used for a diplomatic mission. She selected a flowing sundress that accommodated her pregnancy while projecting confidence and stability, understanding that every detail of her appearance would be scrutinized and potentially used as evidence of her mental state. By the time their guests arrived, the villa had transformed back into its usual facade of tropical perfection, with fresh flowers adorning every surface and the breakfast table set with antique china and crystal that caught the morning light like scattered jewels. But something was fundamentally different this morning. The Hendersons had brought their friend Marco Antonelli, a distinguished Italian man in his mid-50s who carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that suggested significant life experience and professional accomplishment. "Richard, Victoria," Mrs. Henderson said with her usual warm efficiency, "we'd like you to meet our dear friend Marco. He's here on vacation from Rome, and we thought he might enjoy seeing your beautiful property." Marco shook hands with both of them, his intelligent dark eyes taking in details of the villa and its inhabitants with the observational skills of someone trained to notice subtleties. "Thank you so much for welcoming me to your magnificent home," he said in accented but perfect English. "The setting is truly spectacular, and the architecture is remarkably sophisticated." Victoria found herself immediately drawn to Marco's genuine warmth and natural authority, qualities that contrasted sharply with Richard's calculated charm and carefully projected image. During the opening moments of breakfast conversation, she sensed that this man possessed both intelligence and integrity in ways that might prove significant, but the underlying tension from the morning's confrontation remained just beneath the surface like a dangerous current. Victoria could see Richard's jaw tightening whenever Maya approached the table, and she knew that the staff interrogation would resume with increased intensity as soon as their guests departed. The conversation flowed easily between travel experiences, cultural observations, and polite inquiries about the resort business. But Victoria remained hyper-aware of every nuance and undercurrent. She had learned to read the emotional weather patterns of social situations, with the skill of someone whose safety often depended on accurate interpretation of subtle signals. Victoria, Mrs. Henderson was saying, her voice filled with genuine warmth and interest. You're absolutely glowing this morning. The pregnancy suits you beautifully. When is your little one due? 6 weeks, Victoria replied, her hand moving instinctively to her belly in a gesture that had become automatic. We're very excited about becoming parents. The lie came easily, but she could feel the weight of deception in every word. How wonderful, Marco observed with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. The nursery must be nearly finished by now. What room are you converting for the baby? The innocent question dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, creating ripples of tension that spread across the breakfast table with devastating effect. Victoria felt Richard's entire body tighten beside her, and she knew that they had just stepped into the minefield of their most contentious disagreement. We're still finalizing the arrangements, Victoria said diplomatically, hoping to navigate past the dangerous topic without incident. Actually, Richard interrupted, his voice carrying a sharp edge that cut through the pleasant morning atmosphere. We've already determined that the baby will stay in the staff quarters until more permanent arrangements can be made. The main house has certain space limitations that require creative solutions. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips, her expression shifting from polite interest to barely concealed shock. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat with obvious discomfort, while Marco's intelligent eyes sharpened with increased attention to the dynamics playing out before him. The staff quarters? Mrs. Henderson asked carefully, her voice carrying the kind of diplomatic concern that wealthy people used when confronted with socially unacceptable behavior. For a newborn baby. It's a temporary arrangement, Richard said, his tone brooking no discussion and carrying an undercurrent of warning. The main house requires significant modifications before it can accommodate infant care appropriately. Victoria felt 20 years of suppressed frustration and indignation boiling up inside her chest like a volcanic eruption that could no longer be contained. The humiliation of having this conversation in front of strangers was unbearable. But more importantly, she realized that remaining silent would be a betrayal of her unborn child. Richard, that's not what we discussed, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt throughout her body. We didn't discuss anything, Richard replied with cold finality. I made a practical decision about my property based on space requirements and safety considerations. Your property, the words escaped before Victoria could stop them, carrying 20 years of accumulated resentment and newfound understanding of her legal rights. This villa was purchased with my mother's inheritance money. The temperature at the breakfast table seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. Richard's eyes turned glacial, and Victoria realized that she had just made a public declaration of war in front of witnesses who would remember every word of what followed. Excuse me. Richard's voice was dangerously quiet, vibrating with barely controlled rage. The $2 million down payment came from my family trust. Richard, Victoria continued, finding strength in the truth she had discovered. That makes this our property, not your exclusive domain. Everything you have, everything you've ever had, exists because of my work and my vision, Richard snapped, abandoning all pretense of politeness and revealing the controlling nature he usually kept hidden from public view. Your comfortable lifestyle, this villa, your security, your social position, all of it exists because of my business success and strategic planning. Built with my money, Victoria shot back, surprising herself with her own boldness and the clarity of her voice. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the terrace tiles with a harsh sound that seemed to announce the end of any attempt at civilized discussion. You're embarrassing yourself in front of our guests. Victoria, this emotional instability is exactly what I've been concerned about. I'm stating documented facts about property ownership and financial contributions, Victoria replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. Facts that have been deliberately hidden from me for 3 years. The breakfast guests sat in stunned silence as 20 years of marital dysfunction exploded into the open with the force of a dam bursting. Victoria could see Maya and the other staff members frozen at the edge of the terrace, uncertain whether to intervene or retreat from the escalating confrontation. Victoria, Richard said, his voice now carrying a threatening undertone that made the hair on her arms stand up. You're clearly having some kind of emotional breakdown. Pregnancy can cause serious psychological instability in women your age, especially those experiencing their first pregnancy so late in life. There's nothing unstable about a pregnant woman defending her legal rights and her child's welfare, Victoria replied with a strength that seemed to surprise everyone present, including herself. Richard moved around the table toward Victoria, his intention unclear, but his body language aggressive enough to make her instinctively back away, her hand moving protectively to shield her belly from whatever was coming next. Richard! Marco's voice cut through the tension like a precisely wielded blade, carrying an authority that made everyone at the table freeze in place. I suggest you step back from your wife immediately. Richard turned toward the Italian man, his expression furious and his face flushed with the kind of rage that precedes violence. This is a private family matter, he said with dangerous quiet. You have no business interfering in my personal affairs. When a pregnant woman is being threatened in my presence, it becomes very much my business, Marco replied, rising slowly from his chair with the kind of measured authority that suggested significant experience with confrontational situations. Threatened? Richard's voice rose to a shout. I haven't threatened anyone. My wife is having an emotional episode that's unfortunately common in her condition, and I'm trying to manage the situation appropriately. Marco stood completely still for a moment, his intelligent eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. When he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that commanded absolute attention. Mr. Sterling, he said with calm precision, I am Judge Marco Antonelli of the International Family Court in Rome. I am currently on vacation, but I am never off duty when it comes to protecting vulnerable women and children from abuse and intimidation. The blood drained from Richard's face so quickly that Victoria thought he might actually faint. Of all the people who could have witnessed his public loss of control and threatening behavior, a family court judge with international jurisdiction was perhaps the worst possible choice. Now, Judge Antonelli continued with the same calm authority, I suggest you sit down immediately and explain to me exactly why you believe your pregnant wife should be housed in servants' quarters while you occupy a $50 million villa that was purchased with her family inheritance. Victoria felt the baby kick strongly against her ribs, as if responding to this unexpected moment of justice and protection. For the first time in 20 years, someone with actual legal authority was demanding that Richard explain and justify his behavior. The confrontation that Victoria had feared for months had finally arrived. But instead of leaving her powerless and isolated as Richard had planned, it had revealed his true character to exactly the right witness at exactly the right moment. The game had fundamentally changed, and Richard was no longer the only one with power to determine the outcome. In the 6 hours following the explosive breakfast confrontation, Villa Samarapura transformed from a tropical paradise into the nerve center of an international legal intervention. Judge Marco Antonelli had immediately abandoned his vacation plans to address what he described as a clear and present case of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and pregnancy-related domestic violence requiring emergency legal protection. The villa's library had been converted into a war room with laptops, legal documents, and international law references spread across every available surface. Victoria found herself at the center of a rapidly assembling team of legal professionals who had materialized from across the globe with the efficiency of people accustomed to crisis management. Dr. Priya Sharma had arrived within 30 minutes of Maya's urgent phone call, bringing not only her medical bag but also comprehensive documentation of Victoria's stress-related health issues and the potential dangers to both mother and child. Uncle Wyan sat quietly in the corner like a watchful guardian, his presence lending both cultural weight and moral authority to the proceedings. Mrs. Sterling, Judge Antonelli said gently, settling into a chair across from Victoria with the kind of professional compassion that came from years of dealing with domestic abuse cases. I need you to understand that what I witnessed this morning constitutes criminal behavior in most international jurisdictions. Your husband's threats, his attempt to isolate you from property you legally own, and his manipulation of your pregnancy for control purposes are all serious legal matters that require immediate intervention. Benjamin Cole's voice crackled through the speakerphone from London, where he was coordinating with international legal experts and preparing emergency filings. Marco, thank you for intervening when you did. I've been reviewing the documents Victoria sent yesterday, and the situation is even more egregious than she initially described. How so? Judge Antonelli asked, his pen poised over a legal pad as he prepared to document every aspect of Victoria's case. Richard has been systematically hiding assets and manipulating legal documents for decades, Benjamin explained, his voice carrying the outrage of someone who had spent 67 years fighting for justice. The prenuptial agreement is completely invalid due to fraudulent non-disclosure of debts exceeding £2 million. More importantly, Indonesian law has very strong protections for pregnant women in property disputes, especially when there's clear evidence of financial abuse by foreign nationals. Victoria listened to the legal terminology swirling around her, struggling to process how quickly her world had changed. This morning she had been a trapped wife facing an impossible situation. Now she was apparently the protected party in an international legal intervention with resources and advocates she had never imagined possible. What does this mean in practical terms? Victoria asked, her voice stronger than it had been in months. What are my actual options? Dr. Sharma leaned forward, her medical training providing a clinical perspective on the emotional dynamics. It means you have substantial legal grounds to claim ownership of this property and to seek comprehensive protective orders against your husband's harassment and intimidation tactics. But I don't want to fight Richard simply for the sake of fighting, Victoria said, her hand moving protectively to her belly. I want to protect my baby and build a safe, stable life. I want justice, not revenge. Judge Antonelli nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right perspective. Mrs. Sterling, this isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about justice, protection, and ensuring that you and your child have the security and resources you need to build a healthy future. Maya entered the library with fresh tea and the announcement that Richard had barricaded himself in his office, making frantic phone calls to what sounded like his entire legal team in New York and London. He's also been trying to contact the villa staff individually, Maya reported with quiet anger, offering significant bonuses for written statements about your emotional state and behavior patterns. Katut and the others are very upset by his attempts to bribe them into lying. That's witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Benjamin's voice crackled from the phone speaker with professional outrage. Document everything he says to the staff, every offer he makes, every threat he implies. Uncle Wyan spoke for the first time since the meeting began, his weathered voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had spent decades helping women navigate impossible legal situations. In Bali, we have ancient expression, the coconut tree that tries to grow in rocky soil will eventually fall in the first strong storm. This man has been building his power on false ground for many years, and the storm has finally arrived. Judge Antonelli smiled at the elderly Balinese man with genuine respect. Wyan, Maya tells me you have connections throughout the local family court system. Yekran, sir, Judge Sari Dewi is my neighbor's daughter, very intelligent woman, very strong believer in protecting mothers and children from wealthy men who think money makes them above the law. Perfect. I'll contact Judge Dewey this afternoon to arrange an emergency family protection hearing, Judge Antonelli said, making notes on his legal pad. We need to move quickly before Richard can implement whatever legal strategy he's been planning. Victoria felt overwhelmed by the rapid progression of events, the sense that forces beyond her control were suddenly working in her favor, rather than against her. How quickly could this actually be resolved? I'm due in 6 weeks, and I can't handle months of legal battles while caring for a newborn. With clear evidence of financial abuse, document fraud, and pregnancy-related threats, we could have comprehensive protective orders in place within 48 to 72 hours. Judge Antonelli explained with quiet confidence. Property determination might take longer, but your immediate safety and legal standing can be established very quickly under Indonesian emergency family protection statutes. Benjamin's voice came through the speaker again, carrying news that would change everything. Victoria, I've just finished speaking with the senior partners at my firm, and we're prepared to handle this case on a pro bono basis. Your father was my dearest friend, and I failed to protect you from Richard 20 years ago. I won't fail you now. Benjamin, you don't need to. My dear, Benjamin interrupted with the kind of fierce loyalty that transcended professional relationships. Your father saved my life during our military service together. I've been waiting 2 decades for the opportunity to repay that debt by protecting his daughter from a predator who has systematically abused your trust and stolen your inheritance. Dr. Sharma checked her watch and gathered her medical equipment. Victoria, you need to rest now. This level of stress and activity isn't healthy for you or the baby, especially given your elevated blood pressure. I can't rest knowing that Richard is in the next room plotting his next move, Victoria protested, feeling the weight of 20 years of hypervigilance. That's exactly why you must rest, Judge Antonelli said with gentle firmness. Legal proceedings require clear thinking, physical stamina, and emotional stability. Let us handle the immediate crisis management while you focus on your health and your baby's well-being. As the meeting began to disperse, Victoria found herself alone with Maya on the villa's main terrace, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of tropical afternoon that seemed to mock the intensity of the morning's revelations. Maya, Victoria said quietly, watching the sun create patterns of light and shadow through the palm fronds. I'm terrified. What if the legal system doesn't work the way everyone thinks it will? What if Richard finds a way to use his money and connections to take my baby anyway? Madam Victoria, look around you, Maya replied, gesturing toward the villa and the gardens that had become their sanctuary. This morning you were alone with your fear and your secrets. Now you have an international judge, a London barrister, a respected doctor, and the entire Balinese legal community standing with you. Sotrim. But Richard has spent decades building his network of power and influence. Money and influence built on lies and stolen funds eventually collapse under their own weight, Maya said with quiet wisdom. Uncle Wyan says your husband made one catastrophic mistake that will destroy everything he has built. What mistake? He showed his true character to people who have more real power than his money can buy. Maya explained, Judge Antonelli has international legal authority that transcends national boundaries. Your London lawyer has 40 years of experience fighting exactly these kinds of cases. Dr. Sharma has medical evidence that courts take very seriously, and you have something your husband doesn't have and can never acquire. What's that truth on your side and the law's commitment to protecting pregnant women and children? Maya said with quiet confidence. In Bali, we believe that truth is like water flowing downhill. It always finds a way through the strongest stone barriers. That evening, Victoria received a call from Judge Sari Dewi, the Indonesian family court judge whom Uncle Wyan had recommended. The 40-year-old legal expert spoke with rapid-fire precision about Indonesian law, international family court cooperation, and the specific protections available to pregnant foreign nationals facing domestic abuse. Mrs. Sterling, Judge Dewey said in perfect English, tinged with formal legal authority, Judge Antonelli has briefed me comprehensively on your situation. I want you to know that Indonesian courts take extremely seriously the protection of pregnant women, especially when there is documented evidence of financial abuse, property fraud, and emotional manipulation by wealthy foreign nationals. What happens next? Victoria asked, feeling simultaneously hopeful and terrified. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., we will convene an emergency family protection hearing at the regional courthouse. Judge Dewey explained with professional efficiency. Your husband will be legally required to appear and explain his actions under oath. Based on the evidence Judge Antonelli has described, I anticipate issuing comprehensive emergency protective orders. What kind of protective orders? Orders restraining him from threatening you in any way, from interfering with your access to property purchased with your funds, from making any financial decisions affecting your welfare without explicit court approval, and from having any unsupervised contact with you during the final weeks of your pregnancy. Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years, the sense that someone in genuine authority was actually listening to her concerns and taking her situation seriously. Judge Dewey, what should I expect at the hearing? I've never been involved in legal proceedings before. Expect justice, Mrs. Sterling, Judge Dewey replied with quiet confidence. Your millionaire husband may have seriously underestimated both Indonesian family protection law and the international legal community's commitment to protecting vulnerable women and children. As Victoria ended the call, she felt the baby kick strongly against her ribs in what seemed like a response to her decreased stress levels and increased sense of hope. She placed both hands on her belly and spoke quietly to her unborn child. Tomorrow, little one, we find out what real justice looks like, she whispered. And no matter what happens, you're going to grow up knowing that your mother fought for your right to be safe and loved. Outside her window, The Bali sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, like a promise of better days ahead, and a reminder that even the darkest storms eventually give way to clear skies and renewed hope. The villa that had been her prison was about to become the foundation of her freedom, and the child she carried would be born into a world where truth and justice could still prevail over money and manipulation. 48 hours later, the emergency family court session convened in a modern courthouse that overlooked the emerald rice terraces of central Bali, its clean lines and contemporary architecture symbolizing the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern justice. Victoria sat between Benjamin Cole, who had arrived on the red-eye flight from London with a team of international legal experts, and Sari Dewi, her Indonesian legal representative, who radiated the kind of quiet competence that came from years of fighting for women's rights in complex international cases. The courtroom hummed with quiet efficiency as interpreters, court reporters, and legal assistants prepared for what everyone understood would be a landmark case in international family law. Judge Marco Antonelli took his position as presiding officer for the international aspects of the case, while Judge Dewey would handle the Indonesian family law components that formed the foundation of Victoria's protection. Richard entered the courtroom with a team of 3 expensive lawyers from Jakarta's most prestigious international law firm, his confidence evident as he surveyed the proceedings with the air of a man who had never lost a legal battle and didn't expect to start now. He had clearly expected this to be a routine matter, that money, legal maneuvering, and character assassination could easily resolve in his favor. This emergency hearing will address the immediate protection needs of Mrs. Victoria Sterling and her unborn child, Judge Antonelli announced formally, his voice carrying the authority of international law and decades of experience with domestic abuse cases. Mr. Sterling, you stand accused of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, systematic property fraud, and threatening behavior toward your pregnant wife. Richard's lead attorney, a sharp-dressed woman in her 40s with the predatory efficiency of someone who specialized in high-stakes family law, stood immediately with practiced smoothness. Your Honor, my client categorically denies all allegations. Mrs. Sterling is experiencing pregnancy-related emotional instability and prenatal depression that has led to completely false accusations against her devoted and supportive husband. Judge Dewey leaned forward with the kind of judicial skepticism that suggested she had heard similar defenses many times before. Counselor, we will examine the comprehensive evidence before making any determinations about anyone's emotional or mental state. I suggest you prepare your client to address specific financial and legal documents rather than relying on character assassination. Benjamin Cole rose to present Victoria's case, his 67 years of courtroom experience evident in his measured delivery and the calm authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. Your Honors, he began with the precision of someone who had spent decades fighting for justice. The evidence will demonstrate that Mr. Sterling has engaged in a systematic, calculated campaign of financial abuse spanning 20 years. He has deliberately hidden assets, fraudulently misrepresented legal documents, manipulated property ownership records, and explicitly threatened to take custody of his unborn child as punishment for his wife's legitimate assertions of her legal and property rights. The first piece of evidence was the villa purchase documentation, presented with blown-up charts that clearly showed the financial trail from Victoria's family trust to the property acquisition. Mr. Sterling, Judge Antonelli addressed Richard directly, his tone carrying the weight of judicial authority. Did you use your wife's inheritance money to purchase this property? That money became marital property upon our marriage, Your Honor, Richard replied with the smooth confidence of someone who had rehearsed this response. The prenuptial agreement clearly states the division of assets and responsibilities. The prenuptial agreement is completely invalid under international law. Benjamin interrupted with devastating precision, producing a comprehensive legal analysis that had been prepared by 3 different law firms. Mr. Sterling failed to disclose existing financial obligations exceeding £2 million at the time of marriage, which completely invalidates the entire document under both British and international family law statutes. Richard's confident expression began to crack as Benjamin presented document after document showing the scope and sophistication of his financial deception. Bank records, property transfers, insurance policies, and business incorporation documents painted a picture of systematic fraud that extended far beyond simple marital disagreement. Judge Dewey called Dr. Priya Sharma to testify about Victoria's medical condition and the documented health impacts of Richard's behavior on both mother and unborn child. Dr. Sharma, Judge Dewey asked with clinical precision, what is your professional medical assessment of Mrs. Sterling's emotional and physical state? Mrs. Sterling is experiencing chronic stress-related hypertension directly caused by emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and explicit threats regarding her pregnancy and parental rights. Dr. Sharma testified with the authority of medical expertise. Her supposed emotional instability is actually a completely normal physiological and psychological response to systematic manipulation and abuse. And what are the potential health impacts to both mother and child if this stress continues? Continued exposure to this level of chronic stress could result in premature labor, dangerously low birth weight, developmental complications for the baby, or life-threatening preeclampsia for the mother. Dr. Sharma explained with clinical directness, both mother and child require immediate protection from the source of this stress. The courtroom's attention then turned to Maya, who testified with quiet dignity about the systematic isolation and punishment tactics that Richard had employed against Victoria throughout their residence at the villa. He would lock her out of their bedroom for days or sometimes weeks when she disagreed with any of his decisions, Maya stated clearly, her voice carrying the weight of witness testimony. He instructed staff to report on her daily activities and emotional responses. He told me personally that the baby should be housed in servants' quarters rather than in a proper nursery because the child needed to understand its place in the household hierarchy. Uncle Wayan provided crucial cultural and legal context about Indonesian family protection laws, explaining in careful English how Richard's behavior violated not only local customs, but also specific legal protections for pregnant women that had been strengthened in recent years. In Balinese culture and Indonesian law, Uncle Wayan testified with the authority of traditional wisdom, pregnant women are considered sacred, protected beings. Any man who threatens pregnant woman or tries to separate mother from child is violating both cultural taboos and legal statutes that carry serious penalties. But the most damaging testimony came from Richard himself, under direct questioning about his financial disclosure obligations and his treatment of Victoria. He became increasingly defensive, condescending, and revealing of his true attitudes toward both his wife and the legal proceedings. Your Honor, Richard said with barely concealed irritation, my wife has absolutely no understanding of complex international business arrangements. She should be grateful for the lifestyle and security I've provided rather than making these ridiculous claims about property ownership and parental rights. Judge Antonelli's expression hardened with each word. Mr. Sterling, are you suggesting that your wife's inheritance, which you used to fund your business acquisitions, gives her no legal claim to the assets purchased with her family's money? I'm suggesting that emotionally unstable pregnant women often make completely irrational demands that should not be validated or encouraged by legal proceedings, Richard replied, his mask of civility finally slipping completely. The collective intake of breath from the courtroom was audible. Richard had just demonstrated exactly the controlling, dismissive attitude that had brought him to this legal crisis. And he had done it under oath in front of two judges with the power to determine his future. Judge Dewey exchanged a meaningful look with Judge Antonelli before consulting her prepared legal analysis and addressing the court with formal authority. Based on the comprehensive evidence presented, including financial documents, medical testimony, witness statements, and the defendant's own admissions under oath, this court finds clear and convincing documentation of systematic financial abuse, emotional manipulation, property fraud, and explicit threats to the welfare of a pregnant woman and her unborn child. She continued reading from her detailed judgment. Mr. Sterling is hereby immediately restrained from threatening, intimidating, or interfering in any way with Mrs. Sterling's access to properties purchased with her inheritance funds. He is prohibited from making any financial decisions affecting her welfare without explicit court approval. Furthermore, Judge Dewey continued with increasing authority, this court awards Mrs. Sterling immediate and exclusive control of Villa Samarapura and all associated resort properties, as these assets were purchased primarily and substantially with her family inheritance funds despite deliberate and fraudulent exclusion from ownership documentation. Richard's face went completely white as the implications sank in with devastating clarity. His lawyers began frantically whispering among themselves, clearly unprepared for the scope and finality of the court's decision. Judge Antonelli added the crucial international legal components that would ensure the judgment's enforceability across multiple jurisdictions. Additionally, under international family law, Mr. Sterling is permanently prohibited from making any custody claims regarding the unborn child until he has completed court-mandated counseling for financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and anger management, with successful completion certified by court-approved psychological professionals. The court also finds that Mr. Sterling's prenuptial agreement is void ab initio due to fraudulent non-disclosure of substantial debts, meaning Mrs. Sterling has full legal claims to all marital assets purchased with her family funds over the course of their 20-year marriage. Victoria felt the baby kick strongly and repeatedly as the verdicts were read, as if her unborn child was celebrating this moment of justice and protection. For the first time in 20 years, she felt the weight of fear and submission lifting from her shoulders like chains being broken. Mr. Sterling, Judge Dewey concluded with judicial finality, you have 24 hours to remove your personal belongings from Villa Samarapura. You are permanently prohibited from returning to the property or contacting Mrs. Sterling except through court-approved legal representatives. Any violation of these orders will result in immediate arrest and criminal prosecution. As the gavel fell with decisive authority, Victoria felt 20 years of accumulated fear, shame, and submission falling away like old clothes that no longer fit. Her millionaire husband had finally faced consequences for his systematic abuse, and those consequences had been delivered by people whose power and authority transcended his money and influence. Richard left the courthouse surrounded by his expensive legal team, his empire of control crumbling around him with the same ruthless efficiency he had once brought to destroying his business competitors. Victoria walked out into the brilliant Bali sunshine, surrounded by the people who had helped her reclaim not just her legal rights, but her fundamental human dignity. The Villa verdict was more than a legal judgment. It was a declaration that justice could still prevail over manipulation, that truth could overcome decades of systematic lies, and that a woman's worth was never determined by her willingness to accept mistreatment or surrender her rights for the sake of maintaining an illusion of peace. The child growing inside Victoria would be born into a world where protection was real, where powerful people could be held accountable for their actions, and where love was never conditional on silence or submission. 3 months later, as Bali's dry season transformed the landscape into a golden paradise of warm breezes and crystalline skies, Victoria stood on the villa's main terrace, watching the sunrise paint the Indian Ocean in shades of amber and rose. At 8 months pregnant, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to honor both her body's limitations and her spirit's newfound strength. The transformation of Villa Samarapura had been nothing short of miraculous. What had once been Richard's monument to control and manipulation had evolved into Victoria's vision of healing, empowerment, and genuine community. The property now operated as the Samarapura Women's Retreat and Healing Center, offering sanctuary, legal support, and comprehensive services for women rebuilding their lives after financial abuse, domestic violence, or complex international divorces. Maya approached with morning tea, her confident bearing and professional attire reflecting her new role as general manager and director of operations for the retreat center. Their relationship had evolved far beyond employer and employee into a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, shared experience, and common purpose. "Good morning, Victoria," Maya said, using the informal address they had adopted as their friendship deepened and their professional collaboration strengthened. "Dr. Priya will be here for your appointment in an hour, and the new retreat group arrives this afternoon. We have a wonderful group this time, 12 women from 8 different countries." Victoria accepted the perfectly prepared tea, grateful for the ritual that had become one of her favorite ways to begin each day. "Tell me about them. What are their stories?" "Ages ranging from 28 to 63, Maya replied, consulting her tablet with the efficiency that had made her invaluable in managing the retreat's complex operations. A tech executive from Singapore, escaping a controlling marriage. A grandmother from Canada, rebuilding after 30 years with a narcissistic husband. A young mother from Germany, whose ex-husband is using their children as weapons, and several others with equally challenging situations. The retreat center had grown organically from Victoria's legal victory, expanding through word-of-mouth recommendations from the international legal community that had rallied to her support. As news of the successful Indonesian court case spread through family law networks around the world, attorneys began referring clients who needed safe, supportive environments to rebuild their lives while navigating complex legal proceedings. Dr. Priya had established a comprehensive wellness clinic on the property, providing not only medical care, but also therapeutic support, nutritional counseling, and stress management programs. The clinic's holistic approach combined cutting-edge Western medicine with traditional Balinese healing practices, creating a unique environment for both physical and emotional recovery. Maya, Victoria said, settling into the specially designed chair that accommodated her expanding belly while providing proper support for her back. Do you remember what you told me that first night when I overheard Richard's phone call about the bamboo that bends in storms? That the bamboo survives because it bends with the storm, while the rigid tree breaks and falls. Maya replied with a smile that reflected their shared journey from crisis to triumph. You were absolutely right, Victoria continued, her hand moving to cradle her belly as the baby responded to her voice with gentle movements. I spent 20 years bending to avoid being broken, but I never understood that all that bending was actually making me stronger, more flexible, more resilient. Maya's eyes reflected the deep friendship and mutual respect that had developed between them. You are a completely different person now, Victoria. Strong in a way that cannot be taken away by anyone, no matter how much money or power they think they have. And this baby will know what real strength looks like from the very beginning, Victoria agreed, feeling a deep satisfaction at the thought of her daughter growing up in an environment of genuine support and empowerment. She'll understand that strength comes from community and connection, not from isolation and control. The retreat center's financial success had exceeded even Victoria's most optimistic projections. Her natural business acumen, suppressed for 2 decades under Richard's domination, had flourished once she was free to make independent decisions and follow her own instincts. The center commanded premium rates from women who valued not just luxury accommodations, but genuine transformative support during life's most challenging transitions. Uncle Wyan had become the property's director of cultural programs and traditional healing, leading workshops and ceremonies that helped international guests understand Balinese concepts of balance, community support, and feminine strength. His storytelling sessions and traditional blessing ceremonies had become so popular that they were now featured in international wellness and travel publications. Victoria, Maya said, checking her scheduling system with practiced efficiency. Benjamin called from London this morning. Richard's bankruptcy proceedings are moving forward even faster than expected. Victoria nodded with calm acceptance, feeling no satisfaction in Richard's downfall, but also no guilt about the consequences of his choices. How is he handling the financial collapse? His attempt to challenge the Indonesian court ruling backfired completely, Maya reported with professional detachment. The legal fees consumed what remained of his liquid assets, and his business empire collapsed when creditors learned about the hidden debts that invalidated the prenuptial agreement. Benjamin says the dissolution should be complete within 60 days. I genuinely hope he finds peace and gets the help he needs, Victoria said with honest compassion. Hatred and anger are too heavy to carry while pregnant, and our daughter deserves to be born into love and hope, not bitterness and revenge. You're remarkably generous to wish him well after everything he did to you. I'm being practical, Victoria replied with the wisdom that had come from her journey toward freedom. This baby deserves a mother who has processed her pain and chosen forgiveness. Not because Richard deserves it, but because we deserve to be free from the poison of ongoing resentment. Dr. Priya arrived for the weekly appointment with her usual combination of medical expertise and warm personal concern, checking Victoria's blood pressure, monitoring the baby's position, and reviewing the comprehensive health metrics that had improved dramatically since the court proceedings concluded. Everything looks absolutely perfect, Dr. Priya announced with professional satisfaction. Your blood pressure is completely normal. The baby's measurements are ideal for gestational age, and you're showing all the signs of a healthy, low-risk final month of pregnancy. Any restrictions on my activity level? Nothing beyond normal common sense, Dr. Priya replied with a smile. Continue your daily walks. Keep managing the retreat center if it brings you joy and fulfillment. Participate in the cultural programs Uncle Wyan has designed, and simply listen to your body when it tells you to rest. After Dr. Priya left to conduct health screenings for the incoming retreat guests, Victoria walked through the villa grounds with the slow, mindful pace that pregnancy had taught her to appreciate. She observed the staff preparing for the afternoon arrivals, noting how everyone moved with purpose and pride, understanding that they were part of something meaningful that extended far beyond typical hospitality services. Katut approached from the organic gardens, carrying fresh tropical flowers for the guest rooms. His English had improved dramatically as his responsibilities expanded to include groundskeeping for the entire wellness complex, and his natural warmth had made him a favorite among retreat guests. "Miss Victoria," he said with his characteristic gentle smile, "the frangipani trees are blooming especially beautiful this week. In Bali tradition, this means very good fortune for new beginnings and fresh starts." "Oh, no, perfect timing for our new guests," Victoria replied, accepting a perfect white orchid that seemed to glow in the tropical sunlight. "Yes, miss. The ladies who come here always leave much stronger than when they arrive. It's very good work we do together. Your baby will grow up knowing she helped many women find their power again." Victoria felt the baby respond to the conversation with what seemed like approving movement, as if her daughter was already attuned to the healing energy that surrounded the retreat center. That afternoon, Victoria personally welcomed the new retreat group during the orientation gathering in the main pavilion, sharing her own story as both inspiration and practical guidance for their individual journeys toward independence and empowerment. The women represented a diverse cross-section of ages, nationalities, and backgrounds, but they all shared the common experience of rebuilding their lives after relationships characterized by control, manipulation, and abuse of power. This retreat center exists because of legal courage, community support, and the belief that every woman deserves to reclaim her power and build the life she truly wants, Victoria told them during the welcome ceremony. "You're here because other women fought for your right to rebuild your lives with dignity, resources, and hope." A 43-year-old pediatrician from Australia raised her hand with a question that reflected the concerns they all shared. "How do you balance healing from past trauma with planning for a completely different future? How do you know when you're ready to trust your own judgment again?" Victoria placed her hand on her belly, feeling her daughter's responsive movement to the sound of earnest conversation. "I've learned that healing isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending the pain wasn't real," she replied with hard-earned wisdom. "It's about refusing to let someone else's dysfunction and cruelty define your worth or limit your possibilities for the rest of your life." "What advice would you give to women who feel completely trapped by financial dependence?" asked a 34-year-old teacher from Sweden whose husband had hidden assets and manipulated their joint finances for years. "Knowledge truly is power," Victoria replied, echoing Uncle Wayan's counsel that had proven so crucial to her own liberation. "Understand your legal rights in detail. Document everything systematically. Build a support network of people who see your true worth clearly. And most importantly, remember that your value as a human being is never determined by someone else's ability or willingness to love you properly." As the group session concluded and the women dispersed to settle into their beautiful accommodations, Victoria remained on the terrace watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges, purples, and golds that seemed to celebrate the day's possibilities. Maya joined her as the evening air filled with the gentle sounds of tropical birds returning to roost and the distant gamelan music from the village that had become the soundtrack of their new life. "Are you truly happy, Victoria?" Maya asked with the directness that characterized their deepest conversations. Victoria considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, recognizing that happiness might be too simple a word for the complex emotions she experienced. "I'm at peace," she said finally. "I'm living with purpose and meaning. I'm surrounded by people who respect and genuinely care for me. I'm about to become a mother in the most beautiful place on earth, and I'm helping other women reclaim their lives and power. I think that's something deeper and more lasting than happiness. It's fulfillment. Your daughter is incredibly lucky to have you as her mother." "We're all incredibly lucky," Victoria replied with profound gratitude. "A year ago, I thought my life was essentially over, that I would spend the rest of my years as an accessory to someone else's story. Now I understand that everything I experienced was preparing me for this moment, this purpose, this opportunity to build something meaningful from the ashes of what seemed like complete destruction. As night settled over Villa Samarapura like a gentle blessing, Victoria felt overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment of peace, purpose, and anticipation. The villa verdict had provided legal justice, but the real victory was the life she had constructed from that foundation of truth and accountability. Her transformation from trapped, financially dependent wife to empowered entrepreneur and community leader proved that it's never too late to reclaim your power, especially when you stop trying to accomplish that reclamation in isolation and start building the supportive community that makes real change possible. The first cries of Isabella Rose Sterling echoed through Villa Samarapura at dawn on a perfect Bali morning, announcing the arrival of new life into a world carefully constructed around love, community support, and unconditional acceptance. The sound seemed to awaken not just the household, but the entire tropical ecosystem, as if nature itself was celebrating this moment of pure possibility. Dr. Priya guided Victoria through the final intense moments of labor, while Maya held her hand with fierce tenderness and Uncle Wayan chanted softly in Balinese, calling blessings and protection upon both mother and child. The villa's master bedroom had been transformed into a birthing sanctuary, filled with tropical flowers, soft lighting, and the gentle sounds of ocean waves that would become Isabella's first lullaby. "She's absolutely perfect," Dr. Priya announced with professional satisfaction and personal joy, placing the 7-pound baby girl on Victoria's chest with the reverence reserved for miracles. 10 fingers, 10 toes, excellent color and breathing, and clearly her mother's fierce determination already visible in those bright eyes. Victoria gazed down at Isabella's tiny, perfect face, overwhelmed by a love so pure and powerful, it seemed to wash away every painful memory from the past 20 years, leaving only gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this transcendent moment. The baby's dark eyes opened wide, as if taking in her first glimpse of the supportive community that had facilitated her safe passage into the world. "Hello, my beautiful, brave girl," Victoria whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Welcome to your world of strong women, endless possibilities, and unconditional love." Maya wiped tears from her own eyes as she witnessed the profound bond forming between mother and daughter. She will grow up knowing exactly what real love looks like, and she will never doubt her own worth or power. And she'll understand from her very first breath that strength comes from community, not from isolation, Victoria added, already seeing fierce intelligence and alertness in Isabella's perfect features. The next several hours brought a steady stream of visitors eager to meet the newest member of the Villa Samarapura family. Benjamin Cole, who had extended his stay in Bali specifically to be present for the birth, marveled at Isabella's strong grip when she wrapped her tiny fingers around his weathered thumb with surprising determination. "She has her grandfather's hands and her mother's spirit," he told Victoria with deep emotion. "Your father would be absolutely bursting with pride at both of you. This little one is going to change the world." Ketut presented Isabella with a traditional Balinese blessing ceremony, placing small offerings of flowers, holy water, and blessed rice near her bassinet while speaking prayers for protection, wisdom, and prosperity. The entire villa staff had worked together to decorate the property with white orchids and yellow marigolds, creating a celebration of new life that seemed to make the tropical paradise even more beautiful. "In ancient Bali tradition," Uncle Wayan explained to Victoria as she cradled her sleeping daughter, "the first month of baby's life is considered very sacred time. She must be protected and honored as a bridge between the spirit world and human world, carrying wisdom from ancestors and bringing hope for future generations. Then she'll fit perfectly into this community." Victoria laughed softly, careful not to wake her sleeping daughter. "This entire retreat center has become a bridge between women's past trauma and their future empowerment." As Isabella settled into her first days of life with the adaptability that seemed to run in her family, the retreat center continued its operations with even greater purpose and meaning. The presence of a newborn baby added an element of hope, renewal, and possibility that deeply moved every woman who came seeking her own fresh start and new beginning. Dr. Priya observed the remarkable healing environment that had evolved around the villa with the fascination of someone who understood both medical science and human psychology. "I've never seen anything quite like this community," she told Victoria during a postnatal checkup while Isabella slept peacefully in her arms. "The combination of legal justice, financial independence, Genuine emotional support and shared purpose creates opportunities for transformation that go far beyond anything I learned in medical school. That's because we're not trying to fix anyone or impose solutions from the outside, Victoria replied, gently adjusting Isabella's blanket as her daughter stirred. We're simply creating safe space for women to remember who they were before someone else tried to define them, and to discover who they want to become when they're free to make their own choices. The retreat center's international reputation had grown exponentially following Isabella's birth, with referrals now coming from family court judges, divorce attorneys, women's advocacy organizations, and former guests from around the world. Victoria had established a comprehensive scholarship fund using proceeds from Richard's liquidated assets, ensuring that financial resources would never prevent a deserving woman from accessing the support and programs she needed. Maya had proven herself to be not just a natural business manager, but a gifted program developer, expanding the retreat's offerings to include workshops on financial literacy, legal rights education, entrepreneurship training, and leadership development. Her own transformation from domestic abuse survivor to successful international businesswoman inspired every woman who attended her sessions. I never imagined I could run a complex business or manage international programs, Maya told the current retreat group during one of her popular workshops on rebuilding confidence and professional skills. But Victoria showed me that survival skills and business skills are often identical. You learn to pay attention to details, to plan ahead strategically, to trust your instincts, and to build supportive networks that help you succeed. One evening when Isabella was 3 weeks old, Victoria received a phone call that surprised her with its timing and content. Richard's sister Margaret was calling from London, requesting permission to visit Bali and meet her new niece. Victoria, Margaret said carefully, her voice carrying genuine remorse and hope. I know Richard behaved absolutely inexcusably, and our entire family is horrified by what we learned during the legal proceedings, but Isabella is our blood relative too, and we hope you might consider allowing her to know her British family members who had nothing to do with Richard's terrible choices. Victoria considered the request thoughtfully while watching Isabella sleep peacefully in her bassinet, surrounded by the gentle sounds of tropical evening. Margaret, I'm not interested in punishing anyone for Richard's decisions or keeping Isabella from family members who want to love her appropriately. If you want to visit and meet Isabella, you're genuinely welcome here, but I won't expose her to anyone who doesn't completely respect her mother and the life we've built. Of course, and I completely understand your caution, Margaret replied with obvious relief. Victoria, I owe you a profound apology. We all knew Richard could be controlling and difficult, but we had no idea how systematic and cruel his behavior had become over the years. We should have intervened much earlier, and I'm deeply sorry we failed you when you needed family support. The past is past, Margaret, Victoria said with the wisdom that had come from her journey toward forgiveness and peace. What matters now is Isabella's future and surrounding her with people who will love and support her unconditionally. Margaret's visit 2 weeks later proved to be a healing experience for everyone involved. She brought carefully preserved photo albums showing Victoria's father-in-law, who had died before Victoria could meet him, and shared family stories that painted Richard's abusive behavior as a disturbing aberration rather than a family pattern. Your daughter will know she comes from good, decent people on both sides of her family, Margaret promised Victoria during their final conversation before returning to London. And she'll know that her mother is a genuine hero who protected her from a dangerous situation and built something beautiful from the ashes of that destruction. As Isabella grew from newborn to alert infant, the entire villa community celebrated every milestone with the joy typically reserved for extended family. Her first genuine smile appeared during one of Uncle Wyan's traditional storytelling sessions. Her first delighted laugh came in response to Maya singing Indonesian lullabies in the garden pavilion. Her first taste of solid food was a tiny spoonful of perfectly ripe mango from the villa's own organic trees. Victoria documented everything in a detailed journal she planned to give Isabella when she was old enough to understand and appreciate the love and community support that had surrounded her from her very first breath. "My dearest Isabella," she wrote one evening while her daughter napped peacefully beside her, "you were born into a world where women support each other unconditionally, where justice can prevail over manipulation and abuse, and where love is never conditional on obedience, silence, or submission." May you always remember that your worth is inherent and unchangeable, not something that must be earned or that can be taken away. And that strength multiplied by genuine community is the most powerful force in the universe. When Isabella was 6 months old, Victoria received an unexpected letter forwarded through Benjamin's law office from an address she didn't immediately recognize. Richard was writing from a residential treatment facility in England, where he was receiving intensive therapy for narcissistic personality disorder, financial addiction, and anger management issues. Victoria, the letter read in handwriting that seemed smaller and less confident than she remembered. I am writing to acknowledge the tremendous harm I caused you and to take complete responsibility for my abusive, manipulative, and criminal actions. Months of intensive therapy have helped me understand that my behavior was inexcusable and that the damage I inflicted was both deliberate and devastating. I am not asking for forgiveness, as I have no right to expect or request that from you. I only want you to know that Isabella is extraordinarily fortunate to have you as her mother, and I hope you both find lasting happiness and peace in the life you have built without me. Victoria read the letter twice before filing it away in a folder she kept for legal documentation, feeling no anger, no vindication, and no desire to respond. Richard's acknowledgement of his behavior might be important for his own psychological healing, but it had no impact whatsoever on the life she and Isabella were building together. Maya, Victoria said later that day as they watched Isabella playing with colorful toys on a soft blanket under the fragrant frangipani trees. Do you ever think about your ex-husband or wonder what happened to him? Sometimes I wonder if he learned to treat people better after I left, Maya replied thoughtfully. Her attention focused on Isabella's delighted attempts to grasp a bright butterfly mobile. But mostly I think about how completely different my life became when I stopped waiting for him to change and started changing my own circumstances and making my own choices. Isabella will grow up understanding that she has the power to shape her own life and that she never has to accept mistreatment from anyone. Yes, and she will also understand that she never has to face life's challenges alone, because there will always be a community of strong women ready to support and protect her. As the sun set over Villa Samarapura on another perfect Bali evening, Victoria held her daughter close and felt the profound satisfaction that comes from a life lived with purpose, meaning, and authentic connection. The Villa verdict had provided crucial legal justice, but the real victory was the thriving community of strength and healing she had built from that foundation of truth and accountability. The retreat center continued to welcome women from around the world, each one adding her own story of courage and transformation to the villa's growing legacy of empowerment and renewal. Isabella would grow up surrounded by these stories of resilience and rebirth, understanding from her earliest consciousness that women supporting women was not just a philosophy, but a practical way of life that created real change in the world. In the distance, the gentle sound of gamelan music drifted from the village, mixing harmoniously with the rhythmic crash of waves and the soft conversations of the current retreat group, sharing their experiences and insights on the main terrace. Victoria rocked Isabella gently as her daughter settled into peaceful sleep, her tiny face serene and secure in the absolute safety of unconditional love and community protection. Tomorrow would undoubtedly bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight was perfect in its simplicity and completeness. Do you hear that beautiful music, Isabella? Victoria whispered to her sleeping daughter. That's the sound of women finding their voices again, reclaiming their power, and building the lives they truly deserve. And someday, when you're ready, you'll add your own strong, clear voice to that magnificent chorus of courage and hope. The circle of strength that had saved Victoria would continue through Isabella and beyond, reaching into future generations and proving that healing, empowerment, and genuine transformation are gifts that multiply exponentially when shared with generous hearts and unwavering commitment to justice. As the tropical night embraced Villa Samarapura with gentle warmth and endless possibility, Victoria felt profound gratitude for the incredible journey that had brought her home to herself and forward into a future filled with infinite potential for good. The Villa verdict had been far more than a legal judgment or a victory over an abusive husband. It had been the beginning of a legacy that would strengthen, protect, and empower women for generations to come, proving that truth, courage, and community can overcome even the most systematic oppression and create something beautiful, lasting, and transformative from the ashes of destruction.